I am going to be talking about negative rates and the fact that, in my opinion, they boost innovation. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that for the last 40 years, interest rates have been falling, and even nominal rates are now negative. Many commentators, many economic theorists have been arguing that this fall in nominal rates and negative real rates is highly unusual, and that it's having negative consequences for economic growth. Let me explain what those negative consequences are as they see it, and then I'm going to, in the rest of the talk, refute some of the ideas that have been mentioned. In this slide, you can see that Japanese interest rates are negative, and euro area deposit rates are also negative in nominal terms. So given that inflation is positive, it means that we have very negative real rate. The theory is that this is a secular fall in interest rates. Secular in the sense that it's remained as a trend intact over a significant period of time. They've linked this fall in negative interest rates. They've linked the fall in nominal interest rates to evidence of weaker growth in the advanced economies over this period. The proposition is that borrowers have not taken advantage of the fall in rates to create positive productivity growth. The supposition is that negative rates is a disincentive to those who have funds to lend it, and that when it is borrowed, it is being used inefficiently and is not producing the sorts of positive returns to investment that it used to in the past. So excess savings is not a positive, it's a negative. Now, by itself, to me, that seems odd. If we talk about goods and services, we'd argue that falling prices, particularly in real terms, is actually a positive benefit. You think about cars, in real terms, they've fallen. You get more built in to them for the money that you pay. You think about your mobile phone, every year they add new bits to it, new functionality. We see that as a positive for productivity and therefore for growth, or do we? This graphic illustrates what those who argue that this secular fall is leading to slow GDP growth in the advanced economies would argue is evidence. And it is true that in this period, growth as we've been recording it has been relatively weak compared with, say, a 50-year or 100-year average. Theory is that in the long run, there is a positive real return for investors. That in order to incentivize those with capital to lend it to those who want to borrow it, they have to have a positive return. In other words, in order to induce them to give up the right to spend that money themselves today and lend it to someone else to spend it today, they have to be given a positive incentive. They have to at least get back their money in real terms, plus a return on top of that for the opportunity cost of not using that money themselves. And theoretically, that makes perfect sense. So the argument is that there's a natural rate of interest. That natural rate of interest is a function of the balance of savings supply in the economy and investment demand in the economy. And of course, as I said, that interaction of saving and investment leads to a positive real return over which the natural rate will also oscillate over time. So it won't stay at a fixed point. It may shift here and there over time, but it will always come back to some equilibrium level. That is a classical economic theory of natural rates of interest. But does the evidence support that, is what we should ask ourselves. And the answer is, if you look back over 800 years of data, mainly European data, mainly developed markets in Europe, based on markets that are now developed in Europe, amidst the noise of all of this data, we can estimate the long-run trends. And these long-run trends have actually been declining over this vast, deep history that we have accumulated. Rates have not just been falling in nominal terms, they've been falling in real terms as well. So in fact, they don't oscillate around an equilibrium rate. The trend is for ever lower rates. From 10% or so in medieval times to 5% at the start of the Industrial Revolution, around about 1750 or so, to around zero today. That, in fact, is the progression. That, in fact, is what theory should be trying to explain. Not to explain a theory, or not to rationalize a theory that evidence no longer supports. So to my view, the arguments of Larry Summers, Gavin Davis, and a bunch of other eminent economists is that actually they're just plain wrong. The evidence does not support it. Indeed, the evidence shows the opposite. The secular reversals has been increases in real rates and in nominal rates. So what we should explain is, why were those reversals occurring? And we can explain those by the fact that in these periods of reversals in 1320s to 1480s, it was war. Reversals of 1520 to 1650s was partly war and partly the effects of defaults. So a loss of wealth, a loss of the accumulation of savings. That drop in supply can lead to increases in rates because those who want access to this capital have to pay more for it. If we take into account the effects of pandemics, and we are in a pandemic, and if we look at the history of pandemics over the period that we've just discussed, i.e. around 8 centuries, which includes the Black Death and a whole host of other plagues which decimated up to 50% of some of the populations that were impacted by this. For example, England saw a loss of its population of around 8 million or so in the plague that ended in around 1352 or so. And the population fell from around 8 million to just over 4 million. And it led to huge social change, by the way. For example, lots of men died and left lots of their assets to women, and it actually led to their wives, and led to property for them, and it led to voting rights in time. But that's an aside. The effect of pandemics is to reduce real interest rates over time. It's partly because those who have lost money save in order to be able to recoup their losses. So savings increase, and therefore, relative to demand, rates decline because there are fewer borrowers. So pandemics can lead to periods of negative interest rates. In a sense, we're seeing that today with extremely low interest rates and an extension of the period of low interest rates that we've seen in the last few years. But here's the good news. The good news, on top of all of that, is that over time, falling real yields have not slowed growth. Quite the opposite. The period of negative returns for investors has been a period of fast growth. That's the fact. Of course, something needed to have changed in this period pre the Industrial Revolution, because it was absolutely true that pre the Industrial Revolution, increases in population did mean more poverty. That if more people lived, actually, in totality, you were going to be poorer. It was a zero-sum game. An increase in longevity meant you were poorer. An increase in deaths meant you were better off because there's more to go around. But something changed around the period between 1650 and 1750, started in Holland and in the UK, is partly access for Europe to capital, people that they exploited in Asia, in North America, in Africa. But it also coincided with a scientific revolution. You combine that with access to free resources and free capital, meant that something structural changed, that economic growth coincided with rising populations. So it was no longer a zero-sum game. So as Malthus was writing about the fact that famines would lead to death and pestilence, he was right about the past, but he was wrong about the future. The future is actually one where you can have a positive increase in human population associated with faster growth because of productivity, because of the way we make stuff, that we make them smarter, that we increase output per unit of input more and more. And that's been accelerating ever since the period between 1650 and 1750. So rising population and life expectancy are cause and effect of economic growth in the world. But as I said, that has not always been the case. And you can see quite clearly here that the turning point was around about the 17th century. What that tells us is that developed country demographics, and let's focus for a moment on the case of Japan, even with an absolute fall in population taking place, there's no sign that the pace of technological change is slackening. It's still speeding up. And I'll explain why in a few moments. And it's to do with globalization, and it's to do with the spread of knowledge, and it's to do with the speed of adoption of that knowledge. Aging populations, though, could increase saving supply and drive yields even lower. And Japan is a clear case in point of that. But it hasn't led to less innovation. The pace of growth is still accelerating. So theory misses that technological change is the key driver of this change. So economic theory should focus on explaining why falling real yields have gone hand in hand with increased innovation and faster growth in global GDP. From steam and motor ships to railways, to telegrams, to telephones, to electricity, to aviation, blast oxygen, and all of these PCs, MRI units, cell phones, internet, now we've got quantum computers, the Internet of Things. We've got more change in more industries than ever before, from agriculture to manufacturing to medicine. And this pandemic proved it. The technological advances that we have seen in the pharmaceutical industry meant that with the aid of the computing processing speed that we currently have and the innovations that have been underway for about 50 years or so, the speed at which we could find a vaccine was accelerating. If this has occurred 100 years before, we would have seen similar deaths to the ones that we saw from 1918. So a global population death rate of around 100 million or so, but as a fraction of today's population, it would have been much greater than. So there's a new dynamic in place. And we should recognize that. What are savers to do in this kind of environment? What about some of these drivers for growth? Let me just say a few more words about that. It seems to me that the current savings rates that we have are not explained by market risk premium or liquidity. It's the long-term drivers and the fact that they're increasing in pace, that we're not measuring productivity properly, for example, that we've not measured the fact that in our iPhones, for instance, we have technology which 50 years ago was unimaginable. And it's increased our productivity. It's reduced time for us. It's meant that time is not wasted as much as it used to be. And yet, the way we measure it is not taking account of that. The adoption of new ideas is quicker to get to market. Let's think about the fact that in the Industrial Revolution, change was concentrated in Europe. 400 million people. Now, change is 7.7 billion. Instantly communicated to everyone if there's a new idea. Anywhere in that 7.7 billion population. Soon to be peaking at maybe around 10 billion or so. So, ideas get to market quicker. They're adopted everywhere, much more rapidly. But more than that, there's access to best practices, innovation, reduction in wasted time, and all of those things are actually interacting. So given that quantum computers are coming on stream, given that the range of changes occurred across so many different industries, the pace of change, despite where interest rates are, will accelerate, not decelerate. And here's the good news. We need it to. We have the challenges of climate change. We have the challenges of living on a planet with 7.7 billion people and soon to be more than that with the same living standard. We need the cost of capital to be cheap. The good news it is. The good news is that the pace of innovation is rapidly rising. So why not shoot for the stars? Maybe start with Mars. Low risk equals low returns. More risk even higher suggests higher returns. There are huge opportunities for investors to make lots of money from innovation. It needs to be measured properly, and it needs to take account of the fact that there are big challenges that require low cost of capital. Luckily, we have it.